This episode of Street Level contains discussions of trauma, death, childhood loss, emotional isolation, addiction, organized crime, identity struggles, violence, and psychological distress. Listener discretion is advised. There is a moment after trauma where people stop asking who they were before it happened, not because the memory disappears, and not because the pain ever truly leaves them, but because survival changes the question entirely. The person they used to be slowly becomes harder to recognize beneath everything they had become in order to stay alive. For some people, trauma becomes something temporary, a scar they learn to carry quietly while the world continues to move on around them. But for others, it becomes architecture, something permanent, something structural, something holding up every decision they make long after the original wound has healed. Over time, survival stops feeling like a moment and starts becoming an identity. Danny Rand spent years trying to survive long enough to return home, years trapped inside a world built on discipline, suffering, violence, and impossible expectations. Every day became another lesson in endurance, another lesson in pain, another reminder that weakness did not survive for very long in the world that raised him after the crash. And when he finally returned to New York, when he finally stepped back into the life that had been stolen from him as a child, he discovered something terrifying. The hardest part was never surviving the mountain. It was learning how to exist afterwards. Because New York did not remember Danny Rand as a survivor. It remembered him as a ghost, a billionaire heir that should have died years ago, a missing child transformed into something unfamiliar. To some people, he was a fraud. To others, he was a weapon pretending to be human again. And to Danny himself, he was not entirely sure what he had become anymore. Somewhere between the two completely different worlds stood Danny Rand. One world was built on science, discipline, balance, and spiritual purpose. The other was built on greed, corruption, violence, and survival hidden beneath polished skyscrapers and corporate smiles. Danny belonged fully to neither of them. Every step he took through New York felt like someone trying to force two broken identities together before they completely tore apart. And maybe that's why Danny Rand remains one of the most tragic people in Marvel's street-level world. Because beneath the power, beneath the mythology, beneath the glowing fist, in ancient prophecy, is someone desperately trying to answer a question he never stopped asking himself after the plane crash. If survival changes you completely, then who are you supposed to become afterward? New York has always been a city built on contradictions. Hope and corruption, wealth and suffering, power and loneliness. Every street feels like two completely different worlds trying to exist on top of each other at the same time. Towering skyscrapers stretch into clouds while people below them fight every single day just to survive long enough to make it home again. Some people adapt to that pressure. Some people disappear beneath it. And some spend their entire lives trying to figure out where they actually belong inside all of it. And that struggle sits at the center of Danny Rand's story. Because Danny was never just trying to become a hero. He was trying to become whole again. On one side of his life stood Kanman, discipline, spiritual purpose, violence sharpened into control, a world that stripped away weakness until survival became instinct, a place that demanded sacrifice in exchange for power. On the other side stood New York City, corporate corruption, generational wealth, endless greed hidden beneath polished glass towers and expensive boardrooms, a city where people learned very quickly that power rarely belonged to the people who deserved it. Danny Rand returned home carrying both of those worlds inside him, and neither one fully accepted him anymore. To the people of New York, he looked unstable, lost, broken, a billionaire heir speaking like a monk and fighting like a weapon. To the people who raised him in Kunlun, New York represented distraction, weakness, and emotional attachment. He sounds like a Jedi. Danny existed somewhere between those identities, trapped in the middle of two completely different lives that have never should have collided. And maybe that is why Danny Rand's story feels so tragic beneath all the mythology. Because for all the power he carries, for all the legends surrounding the Iron Fist, Danny spends most of his life searching for someone painfully human. Balance. Not balance in combat. Not balance in power. Balance in himself. Before Danny Rand became the Iron Fist, before the mythology, before the power, before New York even knew his name, he was just a child watching his entire world disappear in the snow. Danny Rand's story begins with loss. Not symbolic loss, not emotional distance, real loss. Sudden, violent, life-altering loss that shattered his world before he was even old enough to understand what survival was going to cost him afterward. Before the mythology surrounding the Iron Fist, before Kunlun, before New York viewed him as either a survivor or a fraud. Danny was simply the son of wealthy parents trying to reconnect with his family during an expedition through the mountains. And then everything went wrong. The crash itself feels almost mythological when people talk about Danny Rand's history now. A private plane disappearing into the snow high above civilization. Fire, wreckage, isolation. Parents dying in front of their child while the freezing wilderness closes in around him. It is the kind of trauma that permanently divides a person's life into two separate identities. The person they were before the moment happened, and the person forced to exist afterward. Danny never really got the chance to grieve that loss properly, because survival came first, and survival demanded transformation. That transformation arrived through Kunlun, the hidden mystical city that Danny found near death and brought him into a world completely disconnected from the life he once knew. A world built on discipline, ritual, combat, and emotional control. A place where weakness could get you killed and pain was treated less like something to heal from and more like something to master. For Danny, Kunlun becomes both salvation and imprisonment at the same time. It gives him purpose, structure, strength, the ability to survive the trauma that should have destroyed him completely. But it also stripped away the normal, emotional process of growing up. Danny was not allowed to simply be a grieving child anymore. He had to become something harder, something sharper, something capable of surviving inside a brutal system built around sacrifice and perfection. And over time, Danny adapted to that world because he had no other choice. That is one of the most important things to understand about Danny Rand as a character. His story is not really about power at first. It is about identity erosion. Every year spent in Kunlun pulled him further away from the person he might have become if the crash never happened. The memories of New York slowly became distant and dreamlike, while the expectations placed on him inside Kunlun became his new reality. But trauma has a strange way of preserving unfinished grief. No matter how disciplined Danny became, no matter how powerful he grew, some part of him remained emotionally frozen in the moment he lost his parents. Some part of him was still trying to get home. And eventually, that longing became impossible to ignore. Because survival alone was never enough for Danny Rand. He needed meaning. He needed belonging. He needed to know whether the life stolen from him still existed somewhere beyond the mountains. But returning home did not heal Danny Rand. If anything, New York broke him all over again, because the city he remembered no longer existed, and neither did the person who left it. Danny Rand spent years believing that returning to New York would fix something inside him, that if he could just survive long enough to make it back home, the confusion would disappear, the grief would settle, the fractured pieces of his identity would somehow reconnect into the person he was always supposed to become. But trauma does not work like that. Because when Danny finally returned to New York, he discovered something devastating almost immediately. Home had moved on without him. That the idea sits at the emotional center of Danny Rand's story. Not just the loss of his parents, but the realization that time continued moving while he was trapped somewhere else, becoming someone entirely different. The city kept evolving. Rand Enterprises continued growing. People adapted to his disappearance. Entire lives were built around the assumption that Danny Rand died years ago in the mountains. And suddenly this traumatized stranger walks back into New York carrying ancient philosophy, emotional instability, and the weight of a mythology nobody around him can possibly understand. To the people around him, Danny does not look like a survivor returning home. He looks like a ghost refusing to stay buried. That tension becomes one of the most tragic aspects of the character because Danny genuinely believes he can reconnect with the life he lost. Some parts of him still clings to the hope that returning home would emotionally restore him. But every interaction inside New York slowly forces him to confront a painful truth. The person who left New York as a child no longer exists, and that Kunlun had changed him completely too. His speech feels disconnected from the corporate world around him. His understanding of violence feels shaped by an entirely different moral structure. Even emotionally, Danny struggles to process relationships normally because survival and discipline became the foundation of his entire identity for so many years. And at the same time, New York itself represents everything Kunlun warned him about. Greed, corruption, distraction, power without discipline. Danny spends most of this part of his story emotionally trapped between the two worlds, too spiritually shaped by Kunlun to fully reintegrate into normal society, but too emotionally human to completely abandon the connections he still desperately wants to rebuild. That internal conflict is why Danny Rand often feels so emotionally restless compared to the other street-level heroes. Matt Murdock understands Hell's Kitchen. Jessica Jones understands suffering. Luke Cage understands Harlem. But Danny Rand spends most of his story searching for a place where he actually belongs. Even his role inside Rand Enterprises feels unstable. Corporate boardrooms, legal battles, inherited wealth, public perception all clash violently against the person Kunlun trained him to become. Danny tries to carry spiritual purpose into a city built around profit and control, and the collision between those worlds slowly tears him apart emotionally. And beneath all of this sits one terrifying question Danny cannot escape. Was returning home actually the right choice? Because survival gave Danny Rand power, but returning to New York forced him to confront something far more difficult than combat: identity. But identity alone was never enough for Kunlun, because survival there demanded more than discipline. It demanded transformation. And eventually, Danny Rand stopped being trained to survive. He was trained to become a weapon. Kunlun did not just train Danny Rand to survive. It trained him to surrender pieces of himself in exchange for purpose. That is the uncomfortable truth buried underneath the mythology of the Iron Fist. People hear the title and immediately think power, ancient cities, mysticism, legendary martial arts. But beneath all of that symbolism is something much harsher. Becoming the Iron Fist requires a person to endure isolation, pain, emotional suppression, and endless discipline until identity itself begins dissolving into duty. Danny was shaped by the process from childhood. Every lesson inside Kunlun reinforced the same philosophy. Emotional creates weakness. Attachment creates suffering. Fear creates hesitation. To survive, Danny had to learn to control so absolute that even grief itself became something he buried beneath ritual and combat. So if you really think about it, these guys are Jedis. And eventually, that path led him towards the dragon. The mythology surrounding Xiao Lao feels larger than life inside Marvel lore, but psychologically, it represents something deeply important for Danny Rand's character. The confrontation is not simply about defeating a monster. It is about annihilating fear, destroying vulnerability, proving that he can survive transformation completely, and Danny succeeds. He earns the power of the Iron Fist, a force tied to discipline, spiritual focus, and emotional control, powerful enough to turn his body into a living weapon. In mythology, it sounds triumphant, heroic even, but emotionally, the moment feels more tragic than victorious, because Danny does not emerge from that experience as a normal person anymore. He becomes responsibility, expectation, legacy. The Iron Fist is not simply power, it is inheritance, a role larger than the individual carrying it. From that moment forward, Danny is no longer just surviving his trauma. He is carrying the weight of an entire mythology on top of it. And the problem with becoming a symbol is that symbols are rarely allowed to be human. That emotional conflict follows Danny everywhere afterward. He wants connection, friendship, family, stability. But the Iron Fist constantly demands discipline, sacrifice, and violence. The power inside him becomes both proof of his purpose and a reminder that his life stopped belonging entirely to himself a long time ago. That is why Danny Rand often feels emotionally fractured, even compared to other heroes. Because he is not just balancing two identities, he is balancing humanity against expectation. And eventually, those expectations begin to collide with reality in dangerous ways. Because New York does not care about ancient prophecy, the city cares about survival. For the first time in his life, Danny Rand finally had powerful enough to protect people. But New York was about to teach him something brutal. Power alone does not make someone prepared for the world waiting outside the monastery walls. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Danny Rand's story is that he never truly struggles with strength. He struggles with responsibility. That difference matters because Danny enters New York carrying enormous power, but almost no emotional preparation for the complexity of the world he is trying to save. Kunlun taught him discipline, combat, and spiritual focus, but it did not teach him how to process corruption woven directly into systems too large to fight with violence alone. And that disconnect becomes devastating for Danny emotionally, because deep down, he still wants the world to make sense in simple forms. He wants clear enemies, clear morality, clear purpose, but New York does not operate that way. The city survives inside gray areas. Corporations hide violence behind legal systems. Criminal empires blend into politics and business. Even the people trying to do good are often compromised by fear, exhaustion, or desperation. Danny enters that world believing power can create order. Instead, power isolates him further. That isolation becomes especially visible in the way people react to him. Danny generally wants to help people, but emotionally he often feels disconnected from the reality surrounding him. Years inside Kunlun left him spiritually disciplined but socially fractured. Conversations become difficult. Relationships feel unstable. Even moments of compassion are complicated by the fact that Danny processes the world through trauma and ritual rather than normal emotional development. And the Iron Fist itself only amplifies those pressures, because power changes how people see you. Some people expect miracles. Others expect violence. Some see Danny as unstable. Others see him as a weapon. Very few people simply see him as human. That becomes one of the defining tragedies of Danny Rand's story. The more powerful he becomes, the harder it becomes for him to emotionally reconnect with ordinary life. He wants belonging, but power constantly separates him from the people around him. Every fight pushes him further into mythology, while some part of him still desperately wants something grounded and real. And underneath it all sits fear. Not fear of enemies, fear of himself. Because Danny slowly begins to realizing that power without emotional balance can become dangerous very quickly. Anger sharpens the iron fist. Trauma feeds recklessness. Isolation clouds judgment. The same force meant to protect people can just as easily become destructive if the person carrying it loses control. And maybe that is the real story underneath Danny Rand. Not the mythology, not the glowing fist, not the martial arts weapon, but the terrifying pressure of trying to remain emotionally human while carrying something powerful enough to destroy everything around you. What happens when survival becomes the only thing someone knows? Not for a week, not for a year, but for so long that the person underneath it starts disappearing. Because Danny Rand spent most of his life trying to survive impossible loss, impossible expectations, and impossible responsibility. Every part of his identity was shaped by endurance, by discipline, by pain, by learning how to carry emotional weight without letting it destroy him completely. But eventually, survival creates its own kind of isolation. Because once someone becomes weapon long enough, once they become a symbol long enough, once the world starts expecting strength from them every second of every day, it becomes harder and harder what peace is even supposed to feel like anymore. And maybe that is why Danny Rand's story feels so tragic beneath all the mythology. Because for all the power he carries, Danny spends most of his life searching for something painfully simple, a place he can finally stop fighting. New York changes people. Sometimes it hardens them, sometimes it breaks them, and sometimes it forces them to become something larger than themselves just to survive another day underneath the pressure. Danny Rand survived mountains, mythologies, ancient wars, and the crushing weight of expectations powerful enough to erase most people completely. But survival is never the hardest part of the story. The hardest part was learning how to exist afterwards. Because Danny Rand stands between two worlds that never fully accepted him. One built on spiritual discipline and sacrifice. The other built on corruption, greed, and survival hidden beneath glass towers, neon lights. And somewhere in the middle of those worlds is someone desperately trying to remain human while carrying power that constantly threatens to pull him further away from himself. Maybe that is why Danny Rand matters more than most people often realize. Because beneath the mythology of the Iron Fist is someone struggling with something deeply human. The fear that survival might change you so completely that you no longer recognize the person staring back at you anymore. This has been Street Level, Stories from the Shadows of New York City. If you liked this episode, check out my other shows. The links are waiting for you down in the description. I'd also appreciate it if you checked out some of our other creators in our little group, including Fandoms and Hey Anime, and let them know I sent you. Until next time, keep your eyes on the streets.